Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jeffrey Epstein Show. I'm your host, Bobbycapucci, and this is a morning update. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father. He was, a very powerful man in his time. He had a media empire, was very close to several different intelligence organizations, and was Ghislaine Maxwell's role model, pretty much, right? She really looked up to Robert Maxwell. He was super close to her, so close, in fact, that he named his boat after her. So this article today is going to profile Robert Maxwell a little bit, and I thought it would be a nice add to the catalog considering, she is a lot like her father, and she had a lot of her father's tendencies, and she conducted herself in pretty much the same way that her father did. And like I said a bunch of times throughout the creation of this podcast, Ghislaine Maxwell was raised in an environment that was just filled with these kind of cloak and dagger types, right? Spies, intelligence assets, etc., etc. While you and I grew up maybe sitting around with our parents' friends, watching football or at a barbecue or whatever, her dad's friends would come over and they'd be world powers and they would be intelligence assets, etc., etc. So she grew up a completely different way than the rest of us, and she was groomed for this position from childhood, right? She grew up at her father's knee, and I like to use the analogy of Cersei Lannister with Tywin Lannister. And that's like with Ghislaine and Robert Maxwell. They had that same kind of relationship, and Ghislaine was the same kind of person as Cersei Lannister is. So it's definitely one of those situations where you look at it, and when you look at the whole picture and you read about the way that she was raised and the people she was raised around and who her father is, you can totally see why she turned out to be such a psychopath. So, this article is from the Daily Beast. The headline, Ghislaine Maxwell's father was a dark and mysterious figure, just like Jeffrey Epstein. This article was written by Clive Irving. Ghislaine Maxwell, the most elusive figure in the Jeffrey Epstein story, grew up in a family of dissemblers. In fact, the family business was built on dissembling. Yeah, look, she was in a family that was power hungry, right? The Maxwells were part of the upper crust of society in England. Her dad, Robert Maxwell, who we're talking about in this article, was very cutthroat, did whatever he had to do to make sure that his empire succeeded. And that included fraud and embezzlement and all the beautiful, lovely things we talk about in the Jeffrey Epstein case. This stuff just happened in a vacuum, or did Ghislaine bring over the blueprint with her when she left Daddy's lap? No charges have been filed against 57-year-old Maxwell, but she has been named in civil lawsuits alleging that she acted as a procurer of young women for Epstein. And we know it's much deeper than that. We know that she was a co-conspirator. She was the underboss, co-boss, whatever you want to call it. We know that she was much more than just some lady who brought girls over for Jeffrey Epstein. That's definitely not what she was. She was a lot more than that. She was, like I said, I think she was leading from the shadows, from behind the curtain. Jeffrey Epstein was the figurehead, but don't think for a minute Ghislaine Maxwell didn't have a lot of influence and wasn't pulling the strings when it came to putting these plans into motion. Their relationship has varied over the years from romantic to a more practical partnership in which she used her social connections to introduce Epstein to some notable figures, including Prince Andrew, the raciest member of Britain's royal family. Yeah, we know that her and Prince Andrew are very, very close still to this day. We've read the reports that they're still in contact, they're still emailing each other, etc., etc. And from what I've heard, quality sources, by the way, Maxwell knew the royal family since she's been a kid. And it on record, they say it was later, but from what I've heard, she's been friends with them since she was a kid. And she is a lot closer to the royal family than even the news media has let on. Ghislaine's father, Robert Maxwell, was one of the darkest and most mysterious men to appear in British public life. That says a whole hell of a lot. There's been a lot of real shady, dark characters in the history of England, right? I mean, they've been around for a long time, so there's definitely been some shady characters in their past. For for this to say that, Maxwell's father is one of the most mysterious men, well, that's saying a lot. And I don't disagree, right? Robert Maxwell lived the life of a spy. Let's just be real, folks. Let's just call it what it is, okay? Let's stop pussyfooting around. Let's stop tap dancing around. And let's get down to the meat and potatoes of the whole entire meal, okay? This guy was obviously an asset. Ghislaine Maxwell, also an asset. All right? In my opinion, there's no way they could be anything else. Even his death remains a mystery. In November 1991, he disappeared from the deck of his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, named for his youngest daughter, as it was anchored off the Canary Islands. Like all Maxwell's 9 children, Ghislaine is French by birth. They were all delivered by the gynecologist sister of Maxwell's wife, Betty, at a maternity home in Maisons-Laffitte, a suburb of Paris. I don't really know what that adds to the story, but there you are. Now you have it. They were all delivered by midwives. All right. His naked body was found floating 15 miles away by a fisherman. Pathologists who performed post-mortem examinations disputed the cause of death. Oh, that sounds a little familiar, huh? Who does that sound like? Jeffrey Epstein, perhaps? Coroners disputing the fact, medical examiners not agreeing on the cause of death, etc., etc. 2 said he had fallen from the yacht after suffering a heart attack and drowned. A third said his heart condition had not been responsible, that he had fallen and drowned. Really? I could see if it's the heart condition, right? Somebody has a heart attack, they have a heart condition, they're on the boat by themselves, they suffer from cardiac arrest, next thing you know, they're right over into the water. Then they die. That's pretty simple, right? But is anything simple when it comes to Maxwell? Is anything simple when it comes to Epstein? Is anything simple when it comes to any of these people? Throughout his whole life, Maxwell concealed as much as he revealed. Outwardly, he played the part of a charismatic businessman. But this performance was always based on an increasingly complicated web of companies with links that only he understood. Well, what blueprint does that sound like, huh? Doesn't that sound like our good friend Jeffrey Epstein and the multitude of shell companies and fake companies and ways to move money? I wonder where Jeffrey Epstein got that blueprint. We've seen Epstein do this same sort of stuff, so it's, again, there are no coincidences. There's no way I will believe that there are coincidences left in this case, folks. There's been too many of them that they've asked us to accept. And we all know that many coincidences don't happen in one single area or one case like this, okay? After his death, it emerged that Maxwell Communications Corporation owed money to 43 banks with a total debt of more than $4 billion. Seen through the eyes of a forensic accountant, it seemed like the life of a swindler and consummate conman. But the motivation behind it was more self-created fantasy than greed. This was a pathology that I got to see for myself up close. Yeah, look. This guy was obviously a con man, right? He was definitely, stealing from Peter to pay Paul. He was moving money around that wasn't his. He was chiseling. He was embezzling, etc., etc. And it was a situation where he was robbing people blind all over the place. So anyone could have been involved in his death, right? Any one of these people that he stole money from, or he didn't pay back, etc., etc. Or he could have done something to upset his handlers, and they could be responsible for his death as well. So there are definitely many things out there that could have occurred. And when you have conflicting reports from the medical examiners, well, it leaves the window open for people to speculate. But Maxwell first appeared as a small flickering blob on my radar in 1963, in the first year of my leadership of an investigative reporting team at the London Sunday Times. The paper's science editor suggested that we take a dive into the records of a publishing company called the Pergamon Press, based in Oxford. He explained that Pergamon published scientific journals. Pergamon's list was originally built on an extraordinary coup planned by its owner, Maxwell. So we see from the very beginning, all the way back in 1963, people were taking a look into who Robert Maxwell was, what he was up to, and what sort of pies he had his fingers in, right? So we see that this goes back years and years and years. At the beginning of World War II, a young Czech refugee born Jan Ludwig Hawk enlisted in the British Army as Private Robert Maxwell. By the end of the war, he had fought from the Normandy beaches all the way to Berlin and risen to the rank of captain. In Berlin, Maxwell realized that a mother lode of scientific papers produced in Germany during the war had never been published in the West. While he was still in the British Army, and then in following years, Maxwell arranged through German publishers to share the rights in these papers, and he would publish them in English. So you see, even when he was over there fighting for England, fighting against the Nazis, at the same time, his mind was in motion. Robert Maxwell was already sowing the seeds of the empire he wanted to create while he was in the battlefields of Europe, fighting, as they said, all the way from Normandy to Germany. This was the West Berlin caught in the movie The Third Man, written by Graham Greene, in which Orson Welles is the unscrupulous Harry Lime making shady deals with shady people. Maxwell was not as cynical as Lime, but he became adept at dealing in the hungry trading of the city, where many of the deals were not in money, but in bartered goods. In return for access to the scientific papers, Maxwell could offer in exchange essentials that were in short supply. So we see him already leveraging his position all the way back during World War II, leveraging his position as somebody who has access to a supply of items that are needed, and in return, he's looking to get these scientific papers, get them published, etc., etc. So we see right away, just from this little bit of background from Maxwell, the way he operated. Maxwell's personality thrived in such a world where his fluency in languages and his cunning and wits were fully engaged. He made contacts in Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain that paid off later. Yep, he was very close with the Soviet Union and the KGB. That is definitely talked about a lot. So when I say he was close to several intelligence agencies, I am not kidding. All right, he was definitely close with the KGB, the Mossad, the CIA. I'm sure the British MI6. All of these guys, right? These are all people that Robert Maxwell talked with, was friendly with, conversed with, and I'm sure that he hung around with them as well. But London was a different challenge. There he felt like an outsider in a place where the old boy network still ran everything, particularly in book publishing. Very quickly, he got on the wrong side of them. Yeah, look, England is one of those places, right? Since the Plantagenets invaded and William the Conqueror helped, take England and form it the way that they formed it into the monarchy, etc., etc. There's been a good club, a good old boys club, forever in England, right? And the upper crust runs everything in that country, right? The aristocracy, people of a foregone era almost. So when a guy like Robert Maxwell tries to stick his nose into things, you know that these people are going to pull the plate away from him before he gets himself a bite, right? That's how these people work. He had to earn his place amongst these people. He had to show them just how scummy he was, I guess, to get a seat at the table. At the Sunday Times, we learned enough to figure out that Maxwell had developed a new business that took him way beyond the potential of German archives. Across the world, science was splintering into many more specialized disciplines. Pergamon editors spotted each new field of work as it emerged and contacted its leaders. They were offered positions on an editorial board. A title was created, and a new journal appeared. There was no risk involved. The journal sold on subscriptions at a price that guaranteed profits. Some of the authors complained of being paid a pittance, but that was normal in scientific journals. Yeah, look, he's been we know that he has been very eager to make sure that he hoards the money for himself throughout his life. Robert Maxwell was like the dragon Smaug, right? Sitting upon his pile of gold that he stole from everybody around him. So Robert Maxwell was a fake from the beginning, right? Don't get me wrong, he had some hustle in him. Right? He had a couple of licks. He had a few different hustles that he was engaged in, made himself some money. But at the end of the day, everybody knew what he was. Everybody knew that he was just another snake oil salesman. There was no scandal to be exposed. The one thing that we did discover was why Maxwell was deeply disliked among London publishers. This was because in 1954, a book wholesaler he took over had quickly failed, leaving many publishers with large unsold stocks. And again, this part of the story, look, it's these people, the Good Old Boys Network in England is as big of a problem or more so than the one in America that we find in New York. Because these people are unfortunately, these are the movers and shakers of the world, right? They're involved in all of the biggest businesses. They're involved in all of the highest levels of political decision making. So these are the sort of people that you aren't going to make your way into their circle with new money. Unless, of course, you let them wet their beak a little bit. Once you prove as a valuable commodity to them, as somebody that they can gain some riches from and enrich themselves by associating with you, well, of course, then you have a place at the table. But at this point, Robert Maxwell was seen as an outsider still. One of the publishers was the family firm of a future Tory Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan. "We have lost a fortune, but my lawyers say we'll never get our money back," Macmillan complained. He was a forerunner of many others who did business with Maxwell, and he never forgot. But there was still no story for us. A year later, in 1964, Maxwell was elected to Parliament, part of a resurgent Labour Party after Macmillan had resigned from office following the Profumo scandal. Harold Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister, was apparently well informed about Maxwell's background. He called him the Bouncing Check. Wow, that's hilarious. So, Bouncing Check, and it's spelled C-Z-E-C-H. Bouncing Check. That's creative, huh? I finally met Maxwell in person in 1967. A London court stopped the publication of the gay classic Last Exit to Brooklyn by Hubert Selby. Most London publishers decried the move as a relapse into censorship. But Maxwell supported the ban. Of course he did. Well, you know, these draconian people like Maxwell, they love to support shit like that, right? Who cares what somebody's sexual preference is? Who cares if somebody wants to be gay? We don't have bigger problems than that on this planet, folks, really? If you're sitting around and you're worried about someone's sexual orientation these days, the problem is with you. Go ahead and take a look in the mirror and really take a good hard look at who you are. Because, let me tell you what, we have way bigger problems on this planet. I was then a producer of David Frost's live interview show, and we invited Maxwell to defend his position, alongside the book's publisher, John Calder. Calder got the better of the encounter. He accused Maxwell of supporting censorship. Maxwell said he was against censorship, but then erupted like a Victorian prude. "I've read this book, and I consider it muck and filth of the worst kind." The studio audience greeted this with derision. And it's funny that he would act like this, right? Like he's this. And most of these people who act like they're prudish and act like this sort of stuff offends them are really the sickest people behind closed doors, right? Well, you don't think Maxwell was engaging in all sorts of sick-ass, wild sex orgies and stuff? Come on, that's how these people are. These people are gross like that. They don't look at other people as human beings. They look at them as pieces of meat or something to be played with. We mean less than nothing to these people. Maxwell was unfazed. In the green room, he was an imposing presence, a bear-like hulk, a booming baritone, Bela Lugosi eyebrows, and a bone-crushing handshake. He bore no grudge against Frost. In fact, he had spotted someone he thought might be useful to him. He decided that Frost might help him to achieve his ultimate ambition to get into the television business. In a series of meetings with Frost, which I attended, it became clear that Maxwell was in obsessive pursuit of his own great white whale, in the form of the Australian Rupert Murdoch. And most of us know the story already of the battle between Rupert Murdoch and Robert Maxwell. They were bitter foes, right? These two men both wanted to be in control of media, and both of these men were on a collision course. And that collision course lasted quite some time. A bitter battle was about to erupt between the two men for control of Britain's biggest-selling newspaper, the weekly news of the world. Murdoch won and then outbid Maxwell to add a moribund daily, The Sun, to his Fleet Street table, relaunching it as a racy tabloid in late 1969. And we know that Rupert Murdoch is an unscrupulous cat as well, right? Most of these big media moguls aren't good people, folks. It's not. See, here's the thing. They don't care about journalism. They care about selling units and moving papers, and they care about you watching on TV. So the more salacious the headline, the more BS the story to rope people in, the quicker they are to run it. And that's the biggest problem with media these days, especially the media on TV. It's no longer journalism. It's all about gotcha moments and serving up red meat to their base, as opposed to informing their base and as opposed to giving their base the information that they need to make, concise decisions about what's going on in the country. Instead, they gaslight you. Instead, they give you a bunch of bullshit. Instead, they lie to you and tell you should hate your neighbor because they might have a few different opinions than you do. That's a bunch of bullshit, all right? It's a bunch of BS, and I hate it. And these two men, Rupert Murdoch and Robert Maxwell, are two of the biggest people to blame when it comes to that sort of newscasting and that sort of presentation of the news. Murdoch made it clear that he intended to move next into television, and Maxwell intended to beat him to it. When the government opened up a number of commercial television franchises, Maxwell tried to enlist Frost's help in bidding for one. Frost refused. Murdoch launched his television empire without needing to win a franchise. He spotted the potential of satellite beamed broadcasting and launched Sky in Europe and, of course, ultimately, Fox News. Maxwell never got into television. So, look, the battle between Murdoch and Maxwell was one for the ages, right? You have scummy versus scummier in the middle of a huge battle to try and get on TV. And Rupert Murdoch won out. And Maxwell was stuck with just his print empire. A while after those meetings, Maxwell read a long piece I wrote about the shortcomings, as I saw them, of the British newspaper industry. He invited me and my wife to his country mansion near Oxford to further explore my ideas, he said. It didn't turn out to be a very private experience. Other house guests included several members of the Labour government. I found that they were as leery as I was at the prospect of Maxwell as a newspaper proprietor, even if he supported the party. They liked his company and his wine cellar, but to them Maxwell remained the bouncing check. And again, look, that's as much of an indictment on English high society as it is on Maxwell, right? They're you want to talk about uppity people, you want to talk about, thumbing their nose at you, that's British upper crust, so-called polite society. I am not a fan. As much as I dislike the high society in New York, you can double that for how I feel about high society in England. And when I did talk to him about my ideas, it was apparent he would use a newspaper as he saw fit, with no respect for editorial independence. And that's, as a journalist and, people who report the news, the last thing you want is an editor telling you what you should be reporting on. As a journalist, you should have the freedom to chase down the stories as you see fit and write them as you see fit. The editor has, the job that, he has to go over the piece and make sure it's viable to run and make sure it's legit. But as far as the content of the piece, an editor should never get in the way of that. But one of Maxwell's stock responses was to treat an opposing view as something that might be reversed if he persisted. And we see that same thing with Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein was the same guy. He would be persistent and persistent and persistent, thinking that his charisma would carry the day, thinking that his money would carry the day, and bring you over to his team. After that meeting, he twice offered me a job as an editor. Each time I refused, and in one of those cases, I advised him against buying the paper. I knew he would ignore it. In Maxwell's head, the contest with Murdoch never ceased. He did acquire newspapers in Scotland and in London, where he bought a legendary tabloid, the Daily Mirror. And he followed Murdoch across the Atlantic after he bought the New York Post by buying the New York Daily News. So both of those papers were owned by these two knuckleheads. The Post was owned by Murdoch, and the Daily News was owned by Maxwell. So you see that both of those papers come from a long line of carnival barkers, right? Thankfully, both papers these days, well, of course, there's still, a little tabloidist, a little bit of a tabloid feel to them. They both also produce decent stories, especially in this Epstein case. So, look, I'm not a big fan of tabloid-type media. I'm not a big fan of salacious headlines and clickbait. But I will give the Post and the Daily News their props for the way they've covered this case. They've both done a pretty good job. But he had none of Murdoch's editorial instincts, and the papers were financially hollowed out as Maxwell juggled funds between the 400 private companies that he ran on the basis that nobody else, not even his two sons, Kevin and Ian, who were closest to him, would know how seriously they were building up debt. Yeah, again, just like Jeffrey Epstein, very secretive. Very, very secretive. You can see why Ghislaine Maxwell was drawn to Epstein. You can see why Epstein was chosen to be a participant in this criminal enterprise. After his death, it emerged that Maxwell had looted hundreds of millions from the Daily Mirror pension fund. Eventually, with the help of the British government, the pensioners got half of what they were due. There was kind of a grandiose dementia behind Maxwell's empire. It never approached the omnipotent media power he craved and that Murdoch had achieved. He had the paranoia of someone who felt that he could never trust anyone around him. Well, that comes from being in the world of spycraft. That comes from always being on your toes, even around your friends, because just like in the mafia, you never know who's going to be the one to put a bullet in your head. He had the Daily Mirror executive floor bugged so that he knew what his top managers were saying about him. Although many banks loaned him money, he felt the British bankers in particular held their noses while taking his business. Well, yeah, you were a dirtbag, bro. Of course they did, right? They knew what you were up to. These bankers act like, oh, we don't have any idea. Yeah, right. These people, if you think that they don't vet the people they're lending money to, then you're being very naive. Ian and Kevin Maxwell were acquitted on charges of conspiracy to defraud by a jury in 1996. Kevin was declared bankrupt with debts of $600 million. There are people who believe that Maxwell's departure from the Lady Ghislaine was neither accidental nor voluntary. It was easy to conjure conspiracy theories. His life was in some respects like a John le Carre villain. His connections embraced spooks in London, Tel Aviv, and Moscow. But the clearest motive was the simplest. The game was up. There was no way out of the pit of debt that he had created. Ghislaine Maxwell is variously described as a socialite and, more quaintly, as a member of the plutocratic jet set. Just like good old dad, huh? Like dear old dad. Just what dear old dad wanted his little girl to become. She achieved the inroads with the English proper part of society that Daddy Maxwell could never have achieved. And Ghislaine did that because she was a very, very, very cunning woman. Not only is she evil, she is very cunning. Her father was never in any set and never had any interest in a frivolous life. In that respect, at least, she is not a chip off the old block. Her celebrity, or notoriety, does raise a question familiar to all Maxwell watchers. Where does all the loot come from? The same question is often asked of Epstein. And look, you could see the parallels in this story, folks, right? In this article between Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. And you can see why Ghislaine Maxwell would be attracted to a man like Jeffrey Epstein, and not only attracted to him, but why a man like Jeffrey Epstein would be chosen to take part in this honey trap operation, this blackmail operation. So Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, very similar people, folks. And it should come as no surprise that Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of Robert Maxwell, would search out somebody like Jeffrey Epstein. If you'd like to contact me, you could do that at bobbycapucci@protonmail.com. That's BOBBYCAPUCCI@protonmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter at BOBBY_CAPUCCI. You'll also be able to find a link for my newest podcast, COVID-19, the pandemic that changed everything, inside of the description box. All right, everybody, I'll be back later on with a daily drop. I hope you all have a fantastic day.